Today is the Yahrzeit of my grandfather, of Eliyahu Chaim Carlebach. My grandfather was from both the town of Baden, which is I guess it's in Austria technically, and also Berlin. He was raised in those two cities in Germany and Austria, coming from a prominent family of all of his uncles were either rabbi doctors or bankers or rebbitzins for his aunts, and he grew up in this environment where he was exposed to some Hasidim. There was a Hasidic shtibel that they liked to daven in Baden. You might have heard stories. One of the most famous stories is a story that Shlomo would tell about both Shlomo and my grandfather meeting Moshe Good Shabbos, who was a Kapishnitzer Einikel, who was part of a Hasidic dynasty. So they actually did have exposure to Hasidim, even growing up as part of a kind of rabbinic Yekka family. And from very early on, they really cherished and loved these interactions. I remember one time, many of my fondest memories are from sitting in the sukkah in the back of the Carlebach shul with my grandfather and my grandmother. And one of those times, my grandfather was recounting having met certain Hasidim that were very old when he met them when he was very young. He mentioned three particular different Hasidim or Rebbes that he had met. I think one of them was the Friedeker Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, but there were other significant people that he described that they had seen the eyes of somebody who had seen the eyes of the seer of Lublin. In other words, somehow he made this kind of like these people who were like, 80 years old, and he was very young when he saw them, and when they were very young, they saw somebody who saw the seer of Lublin. And he went on to describe three different great Rebbes that he had seen the eyes of somebody who had seen the eyes of somebody who had seen those Rebbes from 200 years ago. And then I can't even begin to describe kind of the intensity and the magic, but he said then to everyone who was at the sukkah dinner, he said, if you look into my eyes, you'll see the eyes of somebody who saw the eyes of somebody who saw the eyes of those three great Rebbes. And it was almost like an electrical connection to those great masters of the past. So one of the things that my grandfather, a lot of people are familiar with Shlomo telling great Hasidic stories. My grandfather wasn't as famous, didn't make recordings like Shlomo did, although some of his things have been recorded and they're beautiful, and I think Shlomo Katz has been sending me some of his recordings that weren't done so professionally or formally, but they're very deep. But those who knew my grandfather knew that he brought you into that connection to the Hasidic Rebbes, that they literally came into the room with him. And that's the first thing, is that he brought to life the past into the present. And actually I was looking at a Rashi and a Tosfos, and it was reminding me at the beginning of Psachim the beginning of the tractate on Passover, and it was reminding me. See, the Rashi was explaining things more. It was explaining what the Mishnah, the first opening Mishnah, says in Psachim, that it says, Bodkin, we check, we search for the chametz with a candlelight, and Rashi says not to violate the prohibition of possessing or having chametz in your jurisdiction. And the in Tosfos argues and says, no. The real way of getting rid of the chametz is bittul, is just nullifying it, saying that it's like the dirt of the ground. It's you declare it not yours. And the rabbis instituted a stringency to get rid of the chametz, to search and destroy it, so that we don't come to eat it. So that I was thinking, what's really the debate of Rashi and Tosfos? So if you look in the Mishnayos, the Mishnah doesn't really mention so much about bittul as a lechatchila, meaning as the way to actually get rid of the chametz in a regular situation. It mentions it later on as if you're going to do a dvar mitzvah, you're traveling on the road to do a mitzvah, and if you remember you have chametz in the house, and if you're going to go back to actually destroy it, you're not going to have time to then return to do the mitzvah. So the Mishnah says, so then you could be mevatel it, you could nullify it in your heart. Meaning what? That there's a rule, ha'osik b'mitzvah pater min ha'mitzvah. Really, you should go back and destroy it. But because you're doing another mitzvah, so the Mishnah says you don't have to physically destroy it. It's enough to nullify it, to declare it ownerless. But what that really means is that the Mishnah understands that the lechatchila, meaning the appropriate way to destroy chametz, is to physically destroy it, unless there's something blocking you from doing it, like osik b'mitzvah, you're doing a mitzvah. I was thinking, what's the difference between Rashi and Tosfos? And this reminds me of my grandfather. Let me stop for a moment before I tell you what I think one of the differences is that Rashi is looking at the Mishnah through the eyes of the other Mishnayos. He knows the Gemara, but he wants to be able to. There's a history. The Mishnah comes before the Gemara, and therefore he wants to interpret the Mishnah in context of the other Mishnayos. Tosfos doesn't so much see history; he sees it as Torah. Torah is just the Gemara, is just the Gilui Milsa, it's just revealing what's already inside the hearts of the Tanaim. The Amarayim and the Tanaim, they're all really interconnected, and we don't have to kind of thin slice the periods and interpret them according to their own context, like they would do historically. But we're not historians. We're deciphering Torah's Hashem, the Torah of Hashem, and that might be the debate between Rashi and Tosfos. Even within Torah, is there some context of time, of history, or do we transcend history and Torah is Torah's Hashem, and there's no time frame for that? And that reminded me of my grandfather. My grandfather understood. It was a Ba Machshava. He was a person of great understanding, but he understood that Torah is Torah's Hashem. It's the Torah of God. It's not just about context and history and knowledge learning. It was very much about the depth of understanding with the heart. Everything was processed through a deep love that he had to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His learning, his davening, his Avas Hashem, his Avas Yisrael was tangible in its kind of emotionality and interiority. And he actually told me once, he said, everyone says you should go through Shas. He said, do you want to go through Shas? I said, yeah, I want to go through Shas, all of the Talmud. He said, better, in my opinion, that you should do half Shas, but do it not just with Rashi, but also with Tosfos. Everybody's running through Shas, but if you learn Tosfos as well, you'll have a better understanding of what is going on. So that's something a reminder my grandfather's derech halimud. A lot of people don't believe you need to do Tosfos. They say Tosfos he doesn't have the kind of pinpoint accuracy of Rashi, but Tosfos really brings everything together: the past, the present, the future. Tosfos often mixes in to the Gemara like what we do today. He doesn't say, well, that was then, this is, actually he does say that was then and now we don't do whatever it says there, and he tries to figure out a reason if possible. But that's my grandfather. It's not enough to have a history of Torah, but you have to have the past, the present needs to all come together. That's what my grandfather did when he talked about the eyes that saw the eyes that saw the eyes of the seer of Lublin. We really felt that we really made that connection. Talk about learning. My grandfather, along with my father and some of my teachers, put into my heart the importance of learning Torah, that as much as you might think that there's a shortcut or some spiritual hack that you can kind of like feel because you are a chassid and you have a connection to Chassidus or you daven, that somehow that gives you some magical superiority over just kind of like applying yourself to sitting and learning. My grandfather didn't believe in that. I once told him something in the name of a dear mentor of mine, a teacher of mine, Rav Melech Tzvibel, who was the mashpia, who was the kind of spiritual teacher at Tomchei Tmim in Morristown, New Jersey, and they used to send messages to each other because Rabbi Tzvibel started out in Babov and ended up in Chabad, and my grandfather didn't start out in Chabad, but he was in Chabad earlier, and then ended up more in Babov later in his life. So they used to send each other fond messages. And I used to tell my grandfather things that Melech Tzvibel had said, and usually he liked them. But one time I told him something and he didn't like it. What did I tell him? I told him that Rabbi Tzvibel Farbring, he was giving over something at a Farbring, and he said, listen, what's the difference? One of the main differences in the learning between the Chassidim, Chabad Chassidim and Misnagdim, is Chabad Chassidim in yeshiva, they learn for 3 hours a day Chassidus. An hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half at night Chassidus. And then the rest of the day, the 7-8 hours that you have remaining that you're not davening and eating, you learn Gemara. But in the Litvish yeshivas, they don't have Chassidus. Many of the other Hasidim also don't learn Hasidus. They learn 10, 11, 12, 13 hours a day Gemara. So he said, you might think that because for 3 hours we're not learning Gemara, and the Misnagdim are learning Gemara, and therefore the Misnagdim are automatically going to be more learned than you. He said, no, because the power of Hasidus is such that it will enhance the Gemara learning, even though you learn less of it in hours, but your understanding of it will be deepened in the merit of you having learned Hasidus and kind of like made your heart more of a vessel for Torah. I told this to my grandfather, who usually loved Melech Tzvibel, Reb Melech Tzvibel, who was, by the way, somebody, it was a hidden gem in Chabad. He knew all of the Talmud and all the Shulchan Aruch and all of probably the Zohar and the Ari. He knew it all by heart. And nobody ever heard of him, meaning it was, you only heard of him the day you got to the yeshiva, but he knew everything that was written, that was, considered a classic in Judaism. He had read it and he knew it by heart. You could talk to him and learning in anything. But this one thing that I said over, my grandfather not only disagreed with, he said, that's ridiculous. He said, learning, there's no shortcuts for it. If you didn't learn it, you didn't learn it. That's like, how is that, like, if you didn't learn something and the Misnagid learned it, are you saying somehow you're going to magically know it? It's going to like just appear in your heart? He said, you have to learn. So even though, I understand what Meir Siegel was trying to say, but I still remember that my grandfather taught me an important lesson. There's no magic. Spirituality doesn't take the place of actual application of learning Gemara, of learning halacha, of learning in general. So that as much as my grandfather was a big chassid, and of course believed in learning Hasidus, but he just believed that you had to if somebody learned Gemara, that was like, that gave them a certain level of kavod. Didn't matter whether they were a chassid or a misnagid. That stood in its own merit, and it didn't matter if you had some other merit, whether it was yichus or you belonged to a chassidic group. That wouldn't take the place of actual learning. So he always drilled that into my head. So one of the reasons, even though sometimes people say, why do you need, not that I learn so much, I don't learn enough, but I'm just saying when there's so many things to do, why you bother even learning? Why don't you just only be Isaac B'Sechet Sibra, just take care of, there's so many communal needs to do. There's no end. Why do you need to learn? You're a chassid, you're not a misnagid. And I tell them, look, this is what my grandfather, this is the derech, this is the way that my grandfather taught me, which is, of course, you have to have Avos Hashem and Avos Yisrael, but the learning doesn't just come automatically by magic into you. You need to apply yourself. And really, you could take that lesson into anything. Whatever you think is important in life that you want to dedicate yourself to, it's not enough to daven that it should happen to you b'derech memela, meaning automatically without effort. You need to put in the time, you need to put in the energy, and that's something my grandfather taught. And it, simple people would think that what my grandfather was saying is that, unless you're a Torah scholar, you're not a chashuv person, you're not a good person. That's not what he meant. This is a way he would give. Everyone was chashuv. On the contrary, my grandfather was like Shlomo. In real time, he would sit with a homeless person and spend an hour talking to them, 2 hours talking to them, without any regard to the fact that they were, their social status or that they had not clean clothes on. I remember when I was in LA, there was a local meshugana that would go around and harass people. He was almost on the verge of violence, this guy. And somehow he wandered past my parents' home, and this is a guy we were afraid of. The fact that he would come onto the porch of my parents' home would usually be the most frightening thing, because, like I said, he was known to have a certain violent side to him. For an hour, my grandfather entertained this fellow, telling him stories and singing Nigunim with him. I never saw this guy so calm in my life. So my grandfather took a homeless guy, a guy that was not only disrespected but even feared, and he turned him into a loving brother. So on the contrary, my grandfather loved everyone in a beautiful way, but that didn't stop him from telling his own grandchildren not to fool themselves into thinking that they should take a shortcut. And I think that's the essence of love. The essence of love is to have those two parts of yourself, to love unconditionally and to also give the best advice, to be real. And very few people have that today. In fact, a lot of people misunderstood like Reb Shlomo and thought that it was all about the unconditional love and that's it. And maybe that was the emphasis and that's what they needed to hear. But even Shlomo as well also really, he did give chizuk for people to be their best. And those who knew him better than the rest know that Shlomo really did want people to excel at whoever it was that they could be, to be their best. He didn't judge them if they fell short, but he still encouraged them. And that was a thing my grandfather was really known for those who were close to him, is that he would mentor them and that he would try to find the, as we say in Breslov Hasidus, the Nekuda Tova, the kind of the point that they excelled in, the point of their goodness, and help them shine in that area. So that's something that we can do in my grandfather's memory, that if you're a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle or older brother, older sister, or a teacher or a mentor to anyone, if you could do a little bit more of this, helping them shine, helping them achieve greatness and not fooling themselves and making a mistake of just being a mediocre person, and at the same time give them unconditional love. It's something that it's so beautiful in my family. I feel so bad for so many people who are suffering from never having received that type of combination, where it's either they had somebody who loved them unconditionally in a way that was unhealthy, meaning like it encouraged them to misbehave almost because they knew somebody had their back no matter what, or somebody who was always judging them and trying to get them to excel but didn't really love them for who they were. I had the privilege of knowing someone who knew how to love me unconditionally and to try to get me to excel at the same time. It's a very rare combination. And I bless everyone that in his merit and his chus, we should develop that more and teach those who look up to us both the skill sets that they would need to be powerful in a good way and spiritual in a good way, to be learned in a good way, to do better in the world in a good way, and at the same time give them that kind of that foundation, that bedrock foundation of just knowing that they are really ultimately loved unconditionally. May his merit be a Melitz Yosher for his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and for all of those who look up to him.